Hi, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. All right, good afternoon and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Take a Virtual Hike on the Prairie Summer Edition with Bruce Schuette. My name is Emily Gustafson, Missouri Prairie Foundation Director of Operations. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this webinar today. Today's presentation is a pre-recorded video with Bruce Schuette, filmed on June 7th, National Prairie Day at MPF's Pennsylvania Prairie. Bruce is here with us for a live Q&A after the video. During the video presentation, if you have any questions for Bruce, please put them in the Q&A section only on your screen. Once the video concludes, we will read those questions out to Bruce. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. Now a little background on our presenter. Bruce Schuette retired from working for 36 years as a park naturalist at Quiver River State Park, where he was involved in natural resource management, prescribed burns, invasive plant control, ecosystem management, natural resource inventory, collections, monitoring, working with researchers, and nature education. He has served on the MPF board since January 2000, served as secretary 2005 to 2012, and is now Vice President of Science and Management and Chairman of the Science and Management Committee. We are excited to have Bruce here today to show us around the prairie and share his extensive prairie knowledge with us. In just a few short moments, we'll get the video started for our virtual hike on Pennsylvania Prairie in Dade County in Southwest Missouri.
Well, good morning and welcome to Pennsylvania Prairie. My name's Bruce Schuette. I'm the Vice President for Science and Management of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and we're out here on this glorious morning in Pennsylvania Prairie, one of the earlier purchases of the Missouri Prairie Foundation, which has owned this prairie since 1971. This prairie is 160 acres that is all a remnant old growth prairie. So this is one of the really nice prairie remnants left in our state. And so we're fortunate to be out here today on National Prairie Day, which is a day that the Missouri Prairie Foundation had dedicated some years ago as a good time to get out and enjoy our native prairie and native grassland heritage. And this is a perfect example of what we have out here. Here we have lead plant, which is one of the real characteristic plants of our tallgrass prairie. We have seen it before on other virtual hikes, but I don't think we've ever caught it in flower before. We've seen it before it flowered and after it flowered, but here it is in flower. And lead plant is got a really interesting looking flower. It's like this spike of flowers that are purple with gold, the gold being the anthers on the stamens, and it's a member of the pea family or bean family, and so most plants in that family have flowers that are shaped like typical beans and that. However, on this lead plant, apparently one of the petals is curved and forms this like little purple tube that the stamens stick out of. So kind of a unique flower structure on this lead plant. It also has the typical gray, ashy colored foliage because of a dense hairiness on the leaves and the stem. This probably helps kind of reduce the wind velocity to help prevent it from drying out in the summer winds and that sweep across our grasslands. And then also lead plant, besides being a good remnant-dependent species, it's also one that was used medicinally somewhat by Native Americans. We have here a couple other members of the bean or pea family. As we've mentioned before, anytime you visit the prairie, you're going to see a snapshot of what's in flower at that time, but there's going to be other things that have already flowered and are past. There's going to be things that haven't flowered yet. This is one that's already been passed, that's already past flowering. This is cream wild indigo or long-bracted wild indigo. It was already in flower with large sort of pea-looking flowers that are just kind of a pale yellow, kind of a cream color. But now it's already got these seed pods on it, very distinctive looking seed pods, where the flowers were in kind of a low arch. And then right over here is another member of the same family. This is goat's rue, and goat's rue does look very similar to lead plant as far as the foliage. However, the flowers are completely different. This gets large flowers that have the typical bean or pea shape to them. But on this one, it's not just a single color. The flowers are two-tone, with a couple of the petals being yellow and a couple being pink. These are plants that are also had been used medicinally in the past by Native Americans. Okay, here's a beard tongue. I believe this one is called trumpet beard tongue, and this is probably the most of the main white flowered beard tongues we have. This is probably the most characteristic one in our prairies. There's a couple others that either have like a hairiness on the stem, or some that have some bigger flowers, but those are either more woodland or not as much restricted to prairies. This one is a pretty good prairie plant. Real pretty white flowers, and they do have a bit of a curve to them, probably accounting for it being called trumpet beard tongue, and then the way the opening end of it flares out. So this is a good plant, nice one to have out here this time of year in the prairie. Okay, unfortunately, we do sometimes find some plants out in the prairie that don't belong, and one of the worst ones we have in our Missouri prairies is a plant called Sericea lespedeza. This is a native of, I believe it's Asia. It was introduced to North America, and it is spread rampantly across the Midwest and is a frequent invader of prairies. It's one of the things that we have to constantly be vigilant for, and our director of prairie management, Jared Hubner, this is one of his big concerns, is to try and keep this Sericea lespedeza under control and not let it take over and dominate our original prairies like this. The leaves on it, it's very similar to a native plant, some of the native lespedezas we have, but one of the things is typically the leaves tend to be a little bit broader and come to a more abrupt, almost kind of a blunt point, as well as there's some differences in the venation of the leaf and it's also got, I believe it's like hairiness in lines along the stem. But this is one of the native plants. This is slender lespedeza. So this is a good native plant that does belong out here, and you can see it is very similar to the Sericea lespedeza, but the leaves tend to come to a little bit more of a tapered and less blunt looking tip, as well as the differences in the hairiness and the venation. But they do look very similar, but this is one of the main problems we have in protecting our prairies, is trying to keep this and a few other invasive non-native species from really invading and taking over from our beautiful original prairie landscape. An interesting group of plants to have out here on our prairies are orchids. These are true orchids, and Pennsylvania prairie has 3 species of orchids that we know of being out here, and we're very fortunate that one of them is in bloom right now. This is one called the ragged orchid or the ragged fringed orchid, and it's really a little gem of a plant. The flowers are green, obviously, so it doesn't stand out as being as colorful as some of the others. But if you look up close, the shape with that fringe pattern, the lower lip that's got the fringing on it, it's just a spectacular little wildflower, one of our true orchids, and one of almost 290, I believe the list is 289 native species of plants that we have on this prairie. And so we're fortunate that these native orchids are part of our prairie landscape. Here we have a really nice display of some of the really characteristic wildflowers for this time of year, this kind of early summer time period. This is sort of the peak blooming time for pale purple coneflowers, one of the iconic tallgrass prairie species. Just a beautiful plant. They're one of them that ecologically is important as a remnant-dependent species. And then also it was a plant that was used quite a bit by Native Americans medicinally. And so this was a very important plant culturally to have on the prairie also. Along with it, kind of mixed in here, is the sensitive briar, which I think we've talked about on other virtual hikes, but I don't believe we've seen it in flower before. The flowers are just gorgeous. And in fact, with what it kind of reminds you of, mimosa flowers, it is actually in the genus Mimosa. But these flowers, these kind of spherical clusters of purple flowers with the bright yellow stamens sticking out, is just spectacular. However, it is important to remember the name catclaw sensitive briar, because the stems do have some very wicked thorns on it. It's kind of a vining plant. It's got these very wicked thorns on it, and so this is one of the reasons why you probably don't want to walk through a prairie in shorts, because if you do come across this, it could rip you up pretty good. It's also interesting being called sensitive briar because the leaves, the very finely dissected leaves, when you touch them, they do kind of curl up. I don't know if you can see it doing it right there. It is, I think, doing it slowly. Yep, there it goes. And so just the fact that that happens is helps account for its name, sensitive briar. And then finally, right here, as I mentioned before, not everything is going to be in flower now. Some things have already passed, and on previous virtual hikes, we've seen the wood betony or lousewort in flower. Here it is past flower. So this is what it looks like now. And this is one of the plants. It's kind of a partial parasite out here on the prairie. Okay, here we have several different things. First of all, here's the Samson snake root. This is a thing that's in the pea or bean family. It's on some prairies, it's a really almost dominant kind of a low ground cover species. Other prairies you don't find much at all. But on some prairies, this is a very abundant species. And then we also have a couple of the prairie clovers here. And the prairie clovers are both really good remnant dependent species. I think they're both like an 8 on the 0 to 10 scale. So they're very good species to have around. They are very similar. Now, of course, if you see them in flower, then there's no question. There's one is purple and one is white. But when they're not in flower, the leaves look similar, but there are some differences. So it's kind of challenging, but you can tell them apart. This is the purple prairie clover, and you can see how finely dissected the leaves are. And then right over here is a white prairie clover. And you can see these leaves, even though they're still dissected, the dissections, the lobes, are much broader. And so there is a definite difference between the white and the purple in foliage as well as in flower. These were also ones that were used medicinally by Native Americans, and as I mentioned, they're both very good remnant dependent species. So that's our prairie clovers. One of the earliest blooming of our sort of typical tall prairie grasses is eastern gamma grass. And eastern gamma grass tends to kind of grow in clumps like this. It apparently is very palatable, and it's interesting now to see it already in flower. You can see on the male flowers, the stamens are out with the anthers that are producing the pollen, which the wind will spread to the female flowers. And it's also got seed pods like starting to grow, so later on the seeds will be almost like these little kernels. Right in here we've got a couple more of our prairie, our remnant dependent species. We have in flower right now is this beautiful plant called Prairie Indian Plantain, and you can see the flowers on it. And it is a pretty easy plant to spot when it's in flower like this because of the white top. And then also the leaves, it's got very thick leathery leaves that are quite unlike anything else out here. And then also right over here is another very characteristic remnant dependent species in our prairies, rattlesnake master. And rattlesnake master has the leaves that have these little projections sticking out, which make it look sort of like a yucca, but it's actually not related to the yuccas at all. This is a plant that's in the carrot family actually, but it does have these yucca like looking leaves. It's not quite in flower yet. This little spherical cluster on top of the stem, those will open up, so it's not actually in flower yet, but it will be pretty soon, and it actually won't look a whole lot different than this when it is actually in flower. But these are plants we consider remnant dependent ones. Now the way we kind of judge that is going by what's called the C value, and I know we have kind of talked about it a little bit before on some of the other virtual walks, but just very briefly, it's basically a way to score our native plants between 0 and 10 on how faithful they are to a native habitat or a natural community. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're either rare or common. It just means a plant that's got a low score doesn't necessarily need a remnant habitat to exist. Like right here is daisy fleabane. Daisy fleabane is a plant that's characteristic of prairies. You find them in almost all the prairies, but to see the daisy fleabane here doesn't tell you that this is an original remnant prairie. It's got a score of like a 1 or a 2, and so it's a plant that does belong out here, but it doesn't tell you that this was originally a prairie habitat. You can find them along disturbed roadsides, in old fields, in a lot of other more disturbed areas. When you get plants that are in the range of like 4, 5, and 6, they may not be totally dependent on a remnant natural habitat, but usually they are, and they're what usually kind of makes up the bulk of a native remnant habitat. Like out here, the sensitive briar, the Samson snakeroot, many of those species are in that like 4, 5, and 6 range. But then when you get to plants which on the 0 to 10 scale are restricted to prairie or native habitats, you just don't find these growing hardly ever on in disturbed areas. These are the plants that we consider remnant dependent. And so these are the ones that really tell us that this is an original prairie. If this ground had been plowed in the past or very greatly disturbed, then these plants probably wouldn't be here. Maybe a few would survive by pieces of their root that were able to hang on, but for the most part, they're not going to be here if this was really disturbed. So by having plants like the prairie Indian plantain and the rattlesnake master, the pale purple coneflowers, the lead plant, some of these other remnant dependent species I mentioned, that's what really indicates this. That's what really indicates to us that this is a good remnant unplowed prairie natural community. Here we have a nice example of Ohio spiderwort. This is a spiderwort that's the most common one on prairies. You can see the beautiful pale blue flowers. It's also known that the stems are perfectly smooth and have what's called a glaucous coating. It's kind of like a mealy coating that can rub off when you rub your fingers on it. So that's one of the things that helps you distinguish this from other spiderworts that are not like that. The flowers are these really pretty kind of pale blue, but they only last 1 day each. So you can see here some past flowers that are done now. Each flower is supposed to only last 1 day, and then at the end of the day, if you come here in the afternoon, it's almost like the petals almost seem to sort of liquefy or dissolve. It's kind of interesting, but just one day each for these flowers, but with a lot of flowers on the plants, they'll be in bloom for a while. At this time, not only are there some things that have already bloomed and are past flower now, but there's still many things that are not in flower yet. This is one example. This is the prairie blazing star. So probably in like a few weeks, there will be this beautiful spike of deep purple flowers on top of the stem. So at this time, it's not quite in flower, but that will still be to come. But over here we have the starting of one of our plants called obedient plant or false dragonhead. There's 2 species. This one blooms earlier and has thinner leaves, and then there's another species that comes on later in the summer and has wider leaves. But the obedient plants the flowers are very similar. And it's probably called obedient plant because you can take the flower and kind of move it around on the stem a little bit like that, and it stays put. So just an interesting thing about this plant, and probably accounts for why it's called obedient plant. Okay, here we have a nice yellow patch on the prairie that really kind of stands out right now, since most of what we've been seeing has been either more in the blue or purple color group. But here we have a member of the sunflower family called wingstem. And it's called wingstem because if you look down on the stem, there are actually little like wings or wings of leafy tissue in several rows that go along the course of the stem. So it's like these stems do have little wings on them, and that's a very characteristic thing about the wing stem, which is this beautiful yellow you can see contrasting with the pale purple cone flowers, and they go right up on this little mima mound here, which I think we've talked about on past hikes, but is one of the characteristics, seems to be one of the characteristics of our prairies, is having these little mounds, these mima mounds, which have kind of an uncertain origin, but they are characteristic and usually a good sign, because if there's mima mounds, that usually indicates that the ground was not plowed. Here we have a really nice member of the mint family. This one is usually called wild bergamot, and there's a close relative that you find in woodlands that's probably already finished blooming, but this is a species that you find in open areas in our native grasslands. Beautiful plant when it's in flower like this at this time of year, and if you crush the leaves, it does have a very nice minty smell to it. This was a plant that people have used, including Native Americans, for to make tea and also for medicinal purposes. Standing in the middle of an area like this, being surrounded by an abundance of pale purple cone flowers and lead plant and goat's rue and other things, and it's kind of hard to, or oftentimes you don't realize what a special gem we're in, how incredibly rare these kinds of areas are now. At one time, basically, you could have walked from here to the Kansas border 35 miles away and never really left the prairie if you went around just a couple little creek valleys. If you did, they were just, minor little areas of line of trees to go through. So from a time like that, and when there were like 15 million acres of prairie throughout Missouri, to now when there's probably less than 40,000 acres remaining, and only a fraction of that protected. So it's hard to realize what special little isolated gems these are. And in recent years, recent decades, biologists have started to recognize that these remnants of our native habitats are oftentimes almost like islands. And we think of islands as being, this spot of land out in the ocean surrounded by water, so it's a little place that we can live surrounded by something that's inhospitable and we can't live. Well, that's very much what these remnant prairies are like for the dependent life forms that live here. The remnant dependent plant species, for many of the insects, they can be sort of like islands for grassland birds and other animals. So we can now almost think of them as islands in a very fragmented landscape. One of the things that island biogeography has taught us is that if it's a good remnant with a lot of biodiversity, any size island can be important. So even for like our prairies here in Missouri, we have remnants that are hundreds or thousands of acres, but most of our remnants are much smaller, and some of these islands are only 40 acres or 20 acres or 10 acres, but they're still crucially important for the biodiversity that's restricted to that kind of natural community. But as important as the small islands are, and that's what many of our prairies are and are extremely important for that, but obviously the larger the island, the better it is if you can save it. And so Pennsylvania Prairie here was, when we got it, 160 acres. So that's a good size remnant of prairie, a pretty good size island. But we're also very fortunate because it was connected to additional prairie. So off to our north here, we go from Pennsylvania out into what is now called Coin Prairie. The Missouri Prairie Foundation bought part of Coin Prairie in 2006, but another part of it that adjoins Pennsylvania Prairie here, we just acquired earlier this year from the Snaden family, from Patrick Snaden. And so that makes Pennsylvania Prairie, which is 160 acres. And then we are now contiguous with Coin Prairie, which is another 160 acres. So now we have a total of a 320 acre prairie island here. And so having this larger island means you can probably support more species or have larger populations. So the larger the island is helpful, but even the small islands are still crucial in our biodiversity conservation. The Pennsylvania Prairie is noted for probably even setting a world record. For years we've had the Institute of Botanical Training, Justin and Dana Thomas and their crew, do floristic surveys on our prairies. And to do these surveys, they usually do like five transects, 5 parallel transects, and along each transect they have 5 quadrats, which are a quarter meter square, basically a half a meter by half a meter square, which is roughly 20 inches by 20 inches square. And they record all the plants in there and the amount of cover that those plants are producing. And so that gives us a way to see how the prairie is doing, the kind of floristic integrity, and then also it's something that can be comparable from year to year or 5 or 10 year intervals to see if the health of the prairie is being maintained or if something is changing it. In 2018, while doing one of the surveys out here on Pennsylvania Prairie, in one of these quarter square meter quadrats, they recorded 46 species of plants. Pretty amazing that in this small an area they recorded 46 species of plants. And so Justin became curious and found an article, a paper that was written in 2012 that looked at the most biodiverse sampling plots in the world at all these different scales, from smaller than this to bigger than this, including like acres or hectares of like tropical rainforest. And what they discovered is at this scale, this quarter square meter, the record was 44 species of plants in grassland, I believe, in the Czech Republic. And so with the 46 here, that actually seems to have set a new world record for having the greatest diversity at this scale in a quarter square meter plot of anywhere in the world. So just imagine putting this plot down, putting this quadrant down like this, and being able to find 46 species of plants in that quadrant. And also what's even especially impressive is when you look at the average C value, that 0 to 10 scale for those plants, find that the average C value was like 4.7 or 4.8, which is extremely high. That's a little bit higher than the prairie in general was. So it was not a matter of a lot of sort of weedy things or exotic species being in there. It is like high quality remnant dependent species, and having 46 of those species in this size quadrant. Pretty amazing, but that's what they found right here in Pennsylvania Prairie. One of the typical yellow flowers on the prairie at this time of year is large flowered coreopsis, a very pretty member of the sunflower family. And it tends to have leaves that are dissected and are very skinny. Then there's another kind of coreopsis that's also out here. This one, I believe, is a remnant dependent one. And this is finger coreopsis, also a very pretty flower, but where you see the leaves are dissected, but you see they're a little bit broader, the lobes are, and they are almost kind of remind you of a bird's foot. So this is the finger coreopsis with these fewer and broader divisions on the leaves than the large flower coreopsis has. Pennsylvania prairie is a type of prairie community known as a dry mesic sandstone shale prairie. And the reason it's called that, well, dry mesic is just kind of between mesic, like really wet, like down in the bottom, or really dry, like up on a sort of a sun-baked hilltop. So most of our prairies are considered dry mesic, and it's a sandstone shale, which means basically you'll find the underlying bedrock is sandstone or shale, which probably gives the soil a little more acidic properties than if it was like a limestone dolomite prairie. That would be a little more basic. So this bedrock, and in this case sandstone, helps determine factors of the soil that make this a sandstone shale natural community. And also the fact that by having this bedrock pretty near the surface and exposed like this is one of the things that probably has helped protect this prairie, because it would not have been as easy to plow up with all this bedrock at or very near the surface. And so that's why instead of being plowed, it was probably just kept as like a prairie hayfield, and allowed it to continue to, the prairie to continue to exist. A couple more interesting plants out here is this one called prairie parsley, member of the parsley or the carrot family. This one is a remnant dependent species. It's already past flowering, but it's producing its seeds here. Very interesting plant with its kind of dissected foliage. And then right over here is a wild rose. This one is known as a Carolina rose, or it's also sometimes called a pasture rose, but this is a good native species. This is the one most characteristically seen out on our prairies. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our little hike through Pennsylvania prairie this morning. This is an outstanding remnant, a great island of tallgrass prairie remaining here in Missouri, that is owned and managed by the Missouri Prairie Foundation. And like most all of our prairies, it's open for people to come and explore and learn about our prairie natural heritage. So hope to see you around.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for spending the day out on the prairie and providing the wonderful content for the video that we were able to share with folks today. We do have some questions that have been put into the Q&A. So I will just start off with some of those, unless you have anything you want to add before we begin the Q&A.
Uh, just thank you for taking the time to do the video and then editing it and integrating a bunch of little shots here and there into the continuous video. Once again, did an excellent job with that, and thank you for doing all that work to get this put together.
Well, it is always a pleasure to spend time out on the prairie with you, Bruce. And I always come away having learned so much from our excursions. I think folks will notice that it was a very windy morning out on Pennsylvania prairie. But I think we were able to see a lot of plant diversity and get to really see some of the beautiful, beautiful landscape out there in Dade County. So I'm going to start with some of the questions, and I will just
Great.
go through these. And folks, if you have any additional questions, so please put them in the Q&A box on your screen. All right, so first question, Bruce. You did cover this a little bit in the video, but I think it bears repeating. What does remnant dependent mean?
Remnant dependent basically would mean those species that really depend on an unplowed old growth remnant prairie or other remnant habitats even. Along our landscape now, we get many species that can pop up on roadsides and other areas, or in woodland species that will come into woods even that have been grazed or cut over or that. But there are some species that just can't tolerate when the natural conditions of that natural community have been altered significantly. So they depend on having that remnant natural community. That occurs in both prairies, and it can be in other natural habitats or natural communities also, but that would refer to species that really depend on that native remnant condition, all the factors that it provides, and they just can't tolerate having a much more altered system.
Thank you, Bruce. And, this is a great follow-up to what you just mentioned at the end of your remarks. Another question was, is the C value relative only to prairies? Is there an equivalent for other communities, wetlands, for example?
Yeah, the kind of system of the C values that has been put together in Missouri, that was originally done by Doug Ladd, and then most recently it was a published paper by Doug Ladd and Justin Thomas on the C values, and they apply to every native species for the state. So there are the C values, that same concept applies to species that are found in glades and wetlands and woodlands and forest. All the species in Missouri have been given a C value, and in this case, obviously, we're talking about the ones that are in the prairie natural communities, but the C values exist in for all the native species in all the native habitats.
Thank you. We had another question about the C values. If I am integrating native prairie plants into my residential gardens, will I be more successful with plants having lower coefficients of conservatism?
That kind of depends. While under natural conditions, higher C value plants need like the remnant communities, but sometimes just in a planting where you're just actually putting the, directly just putting the seeds in the ground in that, there are some of the high seed value plants that will do okay in plantings. Um, um, like rattlesnake master is one of them that comes to mind. And a number of the other ones can. They oftentimes take a little bit harder maybe to establish, but they can. So in a natural setting, remnant dependent species don't usually come up in an altered system, but in plantings where you've got the seed and planting it directly, some of them will do okay.
Thank you. And related, another question we had was we can purchase plants or seeds of some of the plants that you, Bruce, called remnant dependent, I think as you just mentioned. And does this cause confusion in determining whether an area or a site is a remnant?
Well, I guess potentially it could. Probably not just in kind of like home landscaping situation, but if seeds are being planted in uh, more of a reconstruction, it could, in the future, if somebody's not aware, add to some confusion about whether or not that plant was there originally, or was it simply there because the seeds were directly introduced. I guess one of the things that I recommend is keeping records of what you plant and where you plant it. And then if that question ever comes up, you pretty much know whether or not you planted it or whether or not it was there on its own. But if it's not known, there are times when that can lead to some confusion on if that plant was originally there, if that is actually within its natural range distribution or that.
Thank you, Bruce. And this might be helpful. This is not a question from the chat, but I think might be helpful for folks to hear a little bit about the kind of work that you do and others do in assessing potential prairie remnants. And it typically isn't just one, you don't make an assessment about the remnants based on the presence or absence of one or two plant species. You're looking at the broader community as a whole. And so how do you assess a potential remnant and looking at the broader plant community?
Yeah, and well, one of the things we do if we're like going to look at a prairie that somebody mentions, maybe it's for sale or something like that, or they're looking for certain recommendations. And one of the things we'll do right off the bat is check there is a natural heritage program in Missouri. It's part of the Missouri Department of Conservation. And the Natural Heritage Program has for decades been doing what they call natural heritage inventories and then tracking rare species of plants and animals and particularly good examples of different natural communities in that. So sometimes that can give us some clues if like an area is already known to have had a remnant prairie that maybe was discovered or known about like 30 years ago and there's a record of it. And so that first of all gives us some good clues if we're looking at something that may already be known as a good remnant prairie. And then when we do like assess the site, one of the things we're of course looking for is like in kind of doing a plant list is looking for those remnant dependent species. Generally speaking, though, you can find one or two sometimes in areas that have been somewhat disturbed. Maybe part of the root system survive because these are oftentimes very deep-rooted plants. So maybe, a couple might be hanging on. But usually what we find out is when we look at one of these areas that is a real remnant natural community is that the number of remnant dependent species is pretty high. So like in Pennsylvania Prairie, of course, we've got a good long list for this, but it's about 40 of these remnant dependent species that are known on Pennsylvania Prairie. And similarly on basically all of our prairies, the number of remnant dependent species is, I think, basically 20 and up to about 50 or so. So it's a combination of things like that. If we have, if it was already known, if it does have a number of these remnant dependent species, like I say, not just one or two, but a number of them mixed in. And then when you kind of take the average score of all the species, that C value of all the species, and if the average score is above 4, then it seems to generally be a good example of that natural community. So that usually includes some of the lower C value plants, which of course are out there and still part of the system, but it usually includes enough of the remnant dependent species that if the C value is above 4, that's usually pretty telling that it's a good example of natural community. Something else are the presence of Mima mounds. As they mentioned in the video, Mima mounds do seem to be very highly correlated with remnant prairies in Missouri. And if you find the Mima mounds out there, that's usually a very good sign, because if the area would have been plowed and tilled in the past, then those mounds would have been kind of obliterated by the plowing. So that's another sign that it could be a remnant prairie. And then just any other signs of like soil disturbance or those kind of things. But those are the kind of things we usually look for, a combination of several of those kinds of things that give us some real good clues.
Thank you, Bruce. One more question about remnant dependent plant species. Where can we find scoring information for those remnant dependent prairie species? So that C value information.
Okay, the C value, there was a paper published, and I can't remember the exact title, but I think we could probably make that available tomorrow when you get a copy of the or a link to the recording in that. So you can have that, but it's a paper that was published. But then also, as far as like our particular prairies, I know on the MPF website, for each prairie, under the where we work category, it usually has if there were any surveys done on that prairie, any research projects. And not every prairie, but most of our prairies now have had this floristic inventory, floristic integrity survey done. And in that would be available on the site. And in that, it goes through the total list of species that were found during their surveys, and it will have the C value on those. So it would be available from some other sources like that, but there is the one publication that has the ranking of all the species for Missouri.
Thank you. And we will share that paper in the follow-up email. All right, next question. Do the native prairie plants move around within a remnant or on a prairie site? So will a species that's found in one area potentially migrate to another area and not be found in the original area for a while?
I guess sort of theoretically they can. However, one thing that's really interesting is with the native species in a prairie is that most of the plant species are very long-lived perennials. So the strategy of most of the prairie plants is not to move around quickly and establish new populations. From these, most of their strategy is to um, get established, be very long-lived, and they've got amazing root systems. And with the interconnectedness of the root systems in that, it's really, there's a lot of competition going on for the different soil resources. And so they kind of get established in with these dense root systems, and they're pretty much there for a long time. Now, they can move around some by seeds and that, so they can, probably move around some. But I would say, from what I've heard, that probably it would be a pretty minor amount of like moving around in an established remnant prairie, because like they have their place and they are adapted to, exist in that place with all the competition around them, and not just move around very widely. So, over time, I'm sure they can somewhat, but for the most part, I think they pretty well stay put where you find them. And once they're there and thriving in that little area with everything else around them, then they're usually there for a very long time, unless the prairie gets seriously disturbed.
Thank you, Bruce. So we also have a couple of questions specifically about Pennsylvania prairie. So
Mhm.
the first question is, are Baptisia australis minor and Echinacea paradoxa found on Pennsylvania or Coin prairies?
Um, I I don't believe so. I don't I don't remember having seen the Baptisia australis, the blue indigo. I don't remember having seen it there. I'd have to check the list for sure, but I don't remember seeing it there, and I don't believe it is. And then the Echinacea paradoxa is not found there. We do have some prairies that have it, but generally speaking, the Echinacea paradoxa prefers limestone prairies with the soil type you get from the limestone or dolomite, rather than what you get from like the sandstone or shale. So typically you don't find paradoxa on most of the prairies with sandstone, shale, bedrock. The prairies you do find it on typically, and I'm not saying there's not an exception, but typically it's more on the limestone prairies. And then also paradox is very common on many dolomite glades in the Ozarks. So it seems to like the prairie type that is the most similar to the limestone or dolomite glades.
Thank you, Bruce. So another question about Pennsylvania. So in the video, there was a trickle of water in the prairie swale. So were we seeing a spring, or was that from the recent rain?
At the time we were filming this, it was very wet. Um, so I can't remember for sure that particular spot, if that, because there are a couple swales on Pennsylvania Prairie, so you do get some water drainage through those. I don't know if there's any actual springs, but at times you would certainly get water seeping from, from the ground into the swales and that. But at the time we were had well, on Prairie Day this year, and when we were out there filming this, it was extremely wet. There was water standing kind of in a lot of places, and a lot of drainage going on. So that may not have been a place that typically carries surface water, but just was because of all the rains at that time.
Yeah, and to add to what Bruce said, there had been heavy thunderstorms the night before in southwest Missouri. So it was extremely wet. And that was in a low area on the prairie, but there was a lot of water around
Yeah.
when we were filming this.
Yeah.
Um, another question about the prairie is that the plants we saw out on Pennsylvania were not very tall. Is that because of the time of year, the amount of rainfall, or some other site condition?
It probably would have been mostly just the time of year. Uh, Now, the Southwest Missouri prairies, because the soils are um, generally thinner and rocky, like you saw, you don't get the prairie grasses and stuff. Oftentimes, don't grow as thick and tall as like in prairies farther to the north. Either the very few in North Missouri that are still there, which is very few, or like up into Iowa and that, because you had deeper soils, areas that were glaciated, you had deeper soils. And so sometimes up there, I think the prairies tend to be a little bit thicker and taller. And Southwest Missouri, maybe not quite as much. But in this case, Pennsylvania prairie, the part we were on, was burnt this past dormant season, which is something that, we have to do as far as part of prairie management to maintain the open grassland conditions is to prescribe burns. This area had been burnt just a few months earlier, and so the plants were basically starting from scratch. So at that time they still weren't too tall, but as the summer went on, they would have gotten, especially the grasses and that, would have gotten much taller. So I think probably in that respect, it was mostly just that it was early in the season following a prescribed burn, that the vegetation wasn't too tall yet.
Thank you, Bruce. And that is a great segue into the next set of questions that we have that are about prairie management. So the first one asks, are prescribed burns part of your prairie management? If so, how often and what percentage of the prairie is burned?
Okay, every year we do a work plan with Jared Hubner, our Director of Prairie Management, and outline which prairies are going to have parts burnt and what parts looking to burn like in the upcoming dormant season. Um, so as a general rule, we usually try and burn about 30 to 50% of a prairie in a given year. Occasionally we skip a year, but for the most part, every year about 30 to 50% of the prairie will be burnt. We don't burn more than that because we want to make sure and leave plenty of refuge for some of the remnant dependent insects that might be in a life stage it's vulnerable to a fire, and then also cover for bigger wildlife in that, since there's so little of the prairie left. So we do try and keep a refuge, kind of a refuge part of it each year, but we rotate it around. So about every second or third year, the whole prairie will have been burnt. Let's see. What was other part of it? The question?
Um, the other portion of the question, let me see really quickly,
So,
was how often and what percentage?
okay.
And I think you answered both parts.
Okay, yeah. So most prairies will have a portion burned each year, and that'll rotate around. So we try and do basically like a 2 or 3 year rotation, which seems to be a pretty good um, uh, pretty good for maintaining the prairie and trying to keep the woody plants under control, which is a real challenge of prairie management right now, is keeping some of the woody species like sumac from becoming too dominant.
Thank you, Bruce. And then just a couple of questions about Sericea in particular. So one question was, someone has a piece of property that is overrun by Sericea lespedeza. What is the seed persistence in the soil of Sericea, and how does MPF work to manage or eradicate this invasive plant?
Unfortunately, Sericea is kind of a nightmare species. I think the seed viability in this, I think the seeds can remain viable in the soil for quite a number of years. Can't remember if I've heard like 20 years or something, but anyway, it's quite a number of years that the seeds stay viable in the soil once you have a plant that produces seeds. Um, yeah, it's really a nightmare. What we try and do is most of our remnant prairies, it's not too awful bad in most of the remnant prairies because the remnant prairies themselves do offer quite a bit of resistance to Sericea becoming established. As I mentioned, there's dense root systems underground. There's not a lot of place for new species to come in and get established. So Sericea, even though it can come in and get established and become pretty abundant, it does meet quite a bit of resistance in the remnant prairies. So most of our remnant prairies, it's not like big patches or anything. It's usually scattered individual plants or scattered really small little pockets. And basically, Jared and our other management staff will check the prairies, oftentimes even a couple times on our remnant prairies each season, go around and just spot spray the individual Sericea plants they found. So typically remnant prairies, we just spot spray individual plants or individual little clumps of Sericea, hopefully before it gets too well established, and we just keep that up year after year. Now, on planting sites where there had been more soil disturbance previously, and you don't get all the root structure and the competition and that you get in a remnant prairie, there the Sericea is a much bigger problem. So again, we treat it every year, but sometimes that gets can be considerably worse, much bigger patches than that. We still mostly kind of spot spray it, but sometimes we're talking about bigger spots that may even have to be treated like, from a tractor or something like that. But we treat everything, but we're especially concerned with the remnant prairies to keep the Sericea at very low levels. It would be nice if we could eradicate it. I don't know that that's been very successful anywhere in totally eradicating it, but we certainly have kept it down at very low levels, to the point where in some prairies it's pretty hard to find any out there. But it's a constant job to try and keep that under control.
For sure. And one last question about Sericea management is, can one reliably use a drone to spot Sericea in a prairie? Or besides, are there other techniques that are available to assessing Sericea invasion?
That's a really good question. At this point, I know there are a number of people that are looking at that question. I haven't talked to anybody recently, and actually, I know from the past, if it's like a pretty big patch of Sericea, I've even seen it from a helicopter if you're flying pretty low and slow. So it can show up from the air if it's bigger patches. When it comes down to like, sort of an individual plant or an individual little cluster of 4 or 5 plants or something, I'm not positive, but I know that they are looking at drones for that very reason, that if it does become reliable where you can pick out even the small little imprint of Sericea, and I believe the drones can even then, or in some places they have drones that will even then can be used to apply a herbicide. So that is, I think, a coming technology. I'm not positive if it's here yet. We haven't used it yet, but I know different people are looking at it, and it may be something in the very near future that that is a reliable way to try and treat it.
Thank you. And, we would love, right, to have anything that makes treatment of our grassland invaders like Sericea easier.
Hmm. Yep.
So we eagerly await new technologies to help us with our prairie management. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. Um, as mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded and an email will be sent to you tomorrow with the links and other helpful resources shared. As a reminder, if you would like to visit Pennsylvania Prairie yourself or any of MPF's prairies, including the adjacent Coin Prairie, they are open to the public to enjoy on foot for hiking, photography, and bird watching. And you can learn more about the prairies that we manage at moprairie.org and click on where we work. If you enjoyed this presentation, we hope you'll join us for our next webinar on September 10th with a presentation about river cane as a keystone species in the floodplain and Chickasaw culture with Kent Sandman. Also mark your calendars for September 24th when MPF Executive Director Carol David will be hosting a virtual tour of her home garden. Other in-person events with registration open by tomorrow's follow-up email will include 2 monarch tagging events, one near Rolla and one near Harrisonville, and a Bell Fountain Cemetery and Arboretum Wildwood Valley walking tour with James Fappel in St. Louis. Finally, registration is now open through September 18th for our annual Evening on the Prairie and member meeting event, which is happening on Saturday, September 27th at MPF's Golden Prairie near Golden City, Missouri. We are proud to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Golden Prairie's designation as a national natural landmark. And I will just put in a plug here for the previous virtual hikes that we've done with Bruce, 2 on Golden Prairie. So one in the spring and one in the fall, and 2 on Friendly Prairie, one in the spring and one in the fall. So if you want to get a preview of Golden Prairie in the autumn, check out the virtual hike webinar with Bruce that is on our YouTube channel. So all of these events and more can be registered for on our website under the events tab. And this concludes our broadcast for today. Thank you everyone for joining us, and everyone have a wonderful evening.